You must have been taught back in school about Kenya's independence on December 12, 1963. But what you were never told was the atrocities committed in Kenya by the British before independence. In 1952, the British government stood before the world and made an announcement. Kenya was in crisis. A violent uprising threatened innocent lives. Order had to be restored. So Britain declared a state of emergency. They called it a civilizing mission. They said the camps they built were for rehabilitation, places where misguided rebels could be re-educated, reformed, brought back into society. They said it was humane, necessary, even compassionate. What they didn't say was that Kenya had become something else entirely. A laboratory, a place where new methods of control were tested, refined, perfected, methods so brutal, so effective that decades later, Britain would burn its own files to hide what really happened. And when the truth finally came out, the system they built in those camps was quietly, permanently banned, not just in Kenya. Everywhere. Kenya was never supposed to fight back. By the 1950s, it was one of Britain's prized possessions, a so-called model colony, rolling highlands, fertile farmland, and a white settler population that lived like landed gentry on someone else's land. For decades, the British had taken what they wanted. They seized the best agricultural land, hundreds of thousands of acres, and gave it to European settlers. The Kikuyu people, who had lived and farmed there for generations, were pushed onto crowded reserves, stripped of their heritage, forced to work the same land they once owned, for wages that barely kept them alive. This wasn't accidental, it was policy. A system built on racial hierarchy, on dispossession, on the quiet bureaucratic violence of colonial rule. And for a long time, it worked, until it didn't. In 1952, something broke. A movement rose from the forests and the reserves, a guerrilla resistance the British called the Mau Mau. They struck supply lines, attacked settlers, took oaths of loyalty and secret ceremonies that terrified the colonial administration. This wasn't just rebellion. This was rage. Decades of it finally ignited. But here's the thing. Britain didn't see freedom fighters. They didn't see people defending their land. They saw a problem, one that required a solution. So London approved an emergency plan. Troops were deployed. A state of emergency declared. Security operations launched across the colony. But that was just the public story. Because behind closed doors, something else was being written. A different kind of plan. One that wasn't announced in Parliament. One that didn't appear in official records. Because Kenya wasn't just about crushing a rebellion. It was about testing a new kind of control. A system that wouldn't just defeat the Mau Mau, but break them. Britain didn't just respond to the Mau Mau uprising with force. They re-engineered an entire society. Starting in 1954, the colonial administration launched what they called Operation Anvil. In a single sweep, they cordoned off Nairobi, stopped every African man, woman, and child on the street, checked their papers, searched their homes. Within weeks, they'd arrested over 30,000 people. But this was just the beginning. Across Kenya, entire villages were emptied, families torn apart, hundreds of thousands of Kikuyu were forcibly relocated into guarded settlements surrounded by barbed wire and watchtowers, places the British called protected villages. Protected from what? From themselves, apparently, and those who were deemed contaminated by Mau Mau ideology. They were fed into something new, a detention pipeline. A vast, carefully organized system of camps that stretched across the colony. Dozens of them, each one categorized, each one with a purpose. There were screening centers where suspects were interrogated and sorted, transit camps where they waited, and then the detention camps themselves, divided into categories, white, gray, and black. White camps were for those considered compliant, gray for the wavering, black for the ones they called hardcore. Officially, the British called them rehabilitation centers, places where detainees could be reformed, re-educated, brought back into the fold of colonial society. Unofficially, they were laboratories, because inside these camps, everything was standardized. Interrogation techniques were tested and refined. Punishments were documented in meticulous detail. Psychological and physical coercion methods were applied, then measured for effectiveness. This wasn't chaos. This was system. Guards were trained, protocols written, results reported up the chain of command, all the way to London. The goal wasn't just confession, it was conversion. To break a person down so completely that they would renounce not just the Mao Mao, but their own will. And what happened next? It shocked even some of the British officials who authorized it. What happened inside those camps wasn't random brutality. It was deliberate. Detainees were stripped, beaten, and starved as a matter of routine. They were forced into stress positions for hours, sometimes days. Sleep deprivation was standard, so was isolation. But it went further than that. Sexual violence was weaponized, used not just to humiliate, but to destroy identity. Women were assaulted by guards. Men were subjected to forced acts designed to break cultural and personal dignity. Confessions were extracted through escalating pain. And if you didn't confess, the pressure increased. This wasn't the work of rogue soldiers or sadistic guards acting alone. This was policy. Each camp operated under specific guidelines. Different techniques were tested in different facilities. Some focused on physical coercion, others on psychological manipulation, isolation, humiliation, the destruction of social bonds. Guards received training, they attended briefings, they filed reports. They weren't told to punish detainees, they were told to optimize. Internal documents, later uncovered, revealed the cold clinical language of the operation. One report asked, "How much pressure can be applied before the subject collapses?" Another discussed graduated force, the systematic escalation of pain and deprivation calibrated to individual resistance. They weren't just breaking people. They were measuring how people break. The camps became laboratories of human endurance. How long could someone survive on minimal rations? How many days without sleep before coherence fractures? What combination of isolation and violence produced the fastest compliance? And the results? They were documented, analyzed, refined. Survivors later described camps where you couldn't sit, couldn't sleep, couldn't speak, where the only choice was submission or death. Some chose death. But Britain kept it quiet. The reports stayed classified. The methods stayed hidden. The world saw nothing. Until one camp crossed a line even London couldn't ignore. In March 1959, at a place called Hola Camp, guards received an order: get confessions. Do whatever it takes. 11 men refused, so the guards beat them with clubs, with fists, in the baking sun, without water, for hours. By the end of the day, all 11 were dead. And this time, word got out. The death of Dedan Kimathi, one of the Mau Mau's most prominent leaders, wasn't the problem. He was captured in 1956, tried, executed. The British celebrated it as a victory. No, the problem wasn't him. The problem was what people were starting to see. By the late 1950s, cracks were forming in Britain's carefully controlled narrative. Missionaries working near the camps began writing letters home. They described emaciated detainees, unexplained injuries, mass graves. Doctors, both British and Kenyan, started refusing to sign death certificates that listed natural causes when the bodies told a different story. And then, quietly at first, some colonial officers themselves began to break ranks. One district officer wrote to his superiors, "What is happening here is not rehabilitation, it is systematic brutality." Another described camps where detainees were worked to death, beaten for sport, denied medical care as punishment. These weren't radicals. These weren't activists. These were British officials, people who believed in the empire, and even they couldn't stomach what they were witnessing. Suddenly, the experiment had observers, and some of them were talking. Then came Hola. March 3rd, 1959. 11 men dead in a single day. The colonial government tried to control the story. They called it a tragedy, an accident. They said the detainees had drunk contaminated water, but the autopsies told a different story: blunt force trauma, broken ribs, ruptured organs. These men hadn't died from bad water. They'd been beaten to death, And this time, there were too many witnesses to silence. In London, panic set in. The Colonial office demanded immediate reports from Kenya. They needed answers, explanations, something, anything they could use to contain the damage. What they received terrified them. Internal memos revealed the scope of the camp system, the methods being used, the numbers of dead and disappeared. One wrote, "If even a fraction of this reaches Parliament, we are finished," because the mathematics were simple. Britain had spent a decade telling the world it stood for freedom, democracy, and human rights. It had condemned Soviet gulags, criticized authoritarian regimes, positioned itself as a moral leader in the post-war order. And now there was evidence, undeniable, documented evidence, that Britain had been running its own network of torture camps. If this became public, if the full story reached newspapers, parliaments, international courts, Britain's entire moral authority would collapse. So, they made a decision, not to stop, but to hide. In the months following Hola, something strange happened. Files began to disappear. Reports that had been meticulously kept, interrogation logs, medical records, incident reports, suddenly went missing from colonial archives. Documents were pulled from offices in Nairobi and shipped back to London. And then, they were destroyed, burned in incinerators, shredded beyond recovery, thousands upon thousands of pages, evidence of what had really happened inside those camps, reduced to ash. This wasn't negligence. This was policy. When survivors tried to speak, when they testified about torture, starvation, sexual violence, their accounts were dismissed. British officials called them exaggerations, lies told by criminals, savage propaganda. One government memo described survivor testimony as unreliable narratives from individuals predisposed to dishonesty. The people who had been systematically brutalized were now being systematically erased. And publicly, Britain declared victory. The emergency was ending. The rebellion had been crushed. The camps, those rehabilitation centers, had done their job. Kenya was being prepared for independence. The experiment, London announced, had been a success. Then, quietly, they dismantled it. Camp by camp, the system was closed down. Detainees were released or transferred. Facilities were emptied, repurposed, erased from maps. By the early 1960s, it was as if the pipeline had never existed. But here's what they didn't say. Success wasn't the reason it ended. In classified memos, documents that wouldn't surface for another 50 years, British officials wrote something chilling. They warned that the methods developed in Kenya must never be used again. Not in Malaya, not in Aden, not in Cyprus, nowhere. One memo was explicit. The techniques employed have proven effective beyond expectation. For that reason, they represent an unacceptable risk to British prestige and international standing. Translation? The system worked. It broke people. It extracted confessions. It crushed resistance with terrifying efficiency. But it also left evidence, bodies, witnesses, scars that couldn't be hidden forever. And if the world ever saw the full scope of what Britain had done, if other nations adopted these methods and pointed back to Kenya as the blueprint, Britain wouldn't just lose its moral authority. It would become the thing it claimed to oppose. So the experiment was buried. The camps were erased. The files were burned. And for decades, it worked. After Kenya, something shifted in the corridors of Whitehall. The detention system, the pipeline, the methods, the clinical brutality didn't just disappear. It was studied. Internal committees were formed, reports were compiled, lessons were documented, not for public consumption, but for the archives. What worked, what didn't, what could be refined. The answers were filed away in locked cabinets, stamped secret and eyes only. But here's the thing. Even as they analyzed it, they feared it. Because the experiment in Kenya had revealed something Britain wasn't prepared to confront. It had shown just how far a so-called civilized nation could go, how easily brutality could be systematized, justified, made routine. And if these methods were ever used again, if they were deployed not in a distant colony but closer to home, what then? In private memos, officials voiced a quiet terror. One wrote, "We have developed a system of control that is devastatingly effective. We must ensure it remains theoretical." Another was more blunt. If these techniques were ever applied in Cyprus, Aden, or God forbid within Britain itself, we would lose not just international standing, but our own moral compass. This wasn't about protecting Kenyans. This was about protecting Britain, because the empire had discovered something dangerous about power, something older than Kenya, older than colonialism itself, that once you build a machine designed to break human beings, it doesn't care who you feed into it. The methods developed in those camps, the isolation, the calibrated violence, the psychological demolition, they weren't tied to a place or a people. They were transferable. And that made them terrifying. So, quietly, without announcement or fanfare, a decision was made. The Kenyan model would be shelved. The techniques, banned in all but name. Officers who knew too much were reassigned. Documents were classified at the highest levels. There was no public declaration, no treaty signed, no law passed, just silence. The camps were gone. The files were burned. The witnesses dismissed. For decades, it seemed like the story had been buried forever. But they underestimated one thing: the survivors. Because in the shadows, across decades, those who had been inside the camps didn't forget. They carried the scars. They remembered the names. They knew what had been done. And one day, they would force Britain to face it. For 50 years, the story stayed buried. The camps were forgotten. The survivors grew old. The files, officially, didn't exist. And then, in 2009, something extraordinary happened. 5 elderly Kenyans walked into the British High Court: Paulo Mwokanzili, Ndiku Mutua, Wambugu Wanyingi, Jane Muthoni Mara, Susan Chiongombe Ngondi. They were survivors, and they were suing the British government for what had been done to them in the detention camps more than half a century earlier. Britain's response was immediate. The claims were too old. The evidence was gone. The government had no records of systematic abuse. In legal filings, British attorneys argued the files from that period no longer exist. Any alleged misconduct cannot be substantiated. But the survivors didn't back down. They had their scars, their testimonies, their memories. And then, something unexpected happened. A historian named Caroline Elkins had been digging. For years, she'd been tracking down fragments, witness statements, personal letters, colonial reports that had slipped through the cracks. And in 2011, she found something: a cache of documents. Hidden in a high-security government facility outside London, thousands of files from Kenya, Malaya, Cyprus, Aden, marked secret and deliberately withheld from the National Archives. These were the files Britain said didn't exist, and inside them, everything: interrogation logs, death reports, internal memos discussing acceptable levels of force, photographs of injuries, instructions on psychological coercion, proof. Suddenly, Britain's defense collapsed. The files were real. The camps were real. The torture, documented in Britain's own handwriting, was real. In 2013, the British government did something it had avoided for over 50 years. It admitted liability. Foreign Secretary William Hague stood in Parliament and acknowledged that Kenyans had been subjected to torture and abuse in British detention camps. The government agreed to pay compensation, $19.9 million divided among over 5,000 survivors. And for the first time, Britain said the words, "We recognize that these abuses took place. The experiment was real after all. Not a conspiracy, not exaggeration. Real." But even as the trial closed, even as survivors finally received acknowledgement, one question lingered. If this system was banned forever, if Britain recognized how dangerous it was, how inhuman, how unacceptable, then why do its methods still feel so familiar? Stress positions, sleep deprivation, isolation, psychological disintegration, techniques designed not to leave marks, methods calibrated to break a person without killing them. They didn't disappear. They were passed on, refined, rebranded, exported, from Kenya to Northern Ireland, from British detention centers to Guantanamo Bay, from colonial camps to modern black sites. The experiment didn't end. It evolved. Here's what we know. The Colonial experiment in Kenya wasn't a mistake. It wasn't the work of a few rogue officers or an isolated atrocity born from chaos. It was deliberate, a test run, a carefully designed system to see how far you could break human beings and still call it legal, still call it necessary, still call it civilized. And when it became too visible, too dangerous to Britain's image, they buried it, burned the files, silenced the witnesses, erased the camps from history. But here's the thing about ideas. You can burn paper. You can destroy buildings. But you can't unlearn a method. The logic behind Kenya, the system, the psychology, the cold calculus of control, it never disappeared. It showed up in Northern Ireland in the 1970s. The 5 techniques: stress positions, white noise, sleep deprivation, hooding. It appeared in interrogation manuals used by the CIA, in black sites across the world, in places where the goal wasn't justice, but compliance. The names changed, the locations shifted, but the blueprint, that stayed the same. So the real question isn't what was banned forever. The real question is, who decided when to use it again? And why did they think we wouldn't notice?